The most dangerous mistake a person can make is believing they've already won. That was the thought running through my mind as I watched my wife walk across the courthouse plaza with a smile on her face. Rachel Walker looked confident that morning, the kind of confident that comes from believing the future already belongs to you. The spring sun reflected off the glass walls of the county courthouse, casting bright streaks of light across the concrete. Lawyers moved in and out through the revolving doors carrying leather briefcases. People stood near the entrance drinking coffee from paper cups. It looked like any ordinary weekday in Dallas. But for Rachel, this wasn't an ordinary day. This was supposed to be her victory lap. She adjusted the sleeve of her tailored cream-colored blazer and exchanged a quick glance with Brandon Pierce, the man she thought nobody knew about. He stood a few feet away pretending to scroll through his phone, but every few seconds his eyes drifted back toward her. If you didn't know the truth, you'd think they were strangers. I knew better. The funny thing was that Rachel believed she was walking into court to take control of her future. What she didn't know was that every step she took toward those courthouse doors was leading her exactly where I wanted her to go. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 47 years old. I spent the last 20 years building a construction company from a pickup truck, a borrowed trailer, and a promise I made to myself that I would never quit halfway through something that mattered. The company now employed dozens of people across North Texas. We built office parks, medical facilities, and commercial properties. I wasn't famous. Most people had never heard my name. I preferred it that way. Quiet success gives you something loud success never can. Privacy. Rachel used to understand that. At least I thought she did. For 17 years we built a life together. We bought a home on a tree-lined street. We hosted cookouts on summer weekends. We celebrated anniversaries in restaurants overlooking the water. We made plans. We shared goals. At least that's what I believed. Looking back now, I realized the signs were there long before I noticed them. Small things. Tiny changes. A delayed answer. A distracted smile. A phone screen turned away at just the right moment. But that's the problem with trust. When you give it freely, you stop looking for reasons to question it. Rachel filed for divorce 6 weeks before that morning. The papers arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because it was raining outside. Water streaked across the office windows while I sat at my desk reading words that felt strangely rehearsed. Irreconcilable differences. Equitable distribution. Financial disclosures. The language was cold, efficient, and carefully prepared. Almost as if someone had been planning it for a very long time. Rachel delivered the news with remarkable confidence. She sat across from me at the dining room table and folded her hands together. "I think this is best for both of us," she said. Her voice was calm, practiced, like she had repeated those words in front of a mirror. I simply nodded. No argument. No anger. No pleading. For a moment she seemed surprised. Then the surprise disappeared. She probably assumed I was shocked. Maybe she thought I hadn't processed what was happening. Maybe she believed I was too overwhelmed to react. What she never considered was the possibility that I already knew more than she did. That morning outside the courthouse, I watched Rachel climb the wide stone staircase without looking back once. The confidence in her stride never wavered. She thought the hearing would begin a process she controlled. She thought the paperwork, the timing, and the strategy all belonged to her. She thought she was the one moving the pieces across the board. The truth was much simpler. Rachel believed she had spent months planning my downfall. What she didn't know was that 3 months earlier, one careless sentence had changed everything. And from that moment forward, while she was planning her next move, I was already 10 steps ahead. 3 months before Rachel filed for divorce, I came home earlier than usual on a Thursday afternoon. A storm had rolled across North Texas, shutting down a project inspection and leaving me with an unexpected few hours. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioner. I remember setting my keys on the kitchen counter and noticing Rachel's voice drifting in from the sunroom. She was on the phone. At first I was not paying attention. After 17 years of marriage, you learn to tune out ordinary conversations. I poured myself a glass of water and started walking toward my office. Then I heard my name. That made me stop. Not because she sounded angry. Quite the opposite. She sounded amused. There was a lightness in her voice that I had not heard directed toward me in a long time. I stayed where I was. The hallway connected to the sunroom through a partially open doorway, and her words carried clearly through the house. "He still thinks everything is normal," she said. A soft laugh followed. "Honestly, He has no idea what is coming. I stood there holding the glass. The ice cubes slowly settled against the sides. For a moment, I considered walking in and announcing I was home. Instead, I remained silent. Something about the confidence in her voice made me listen. Looking back, that was the moment everything changed. Rachel continued talking. She spoke about timelines, documents, meetings, things that sounded strangely organized. Not emotional, not impulsive, planned. I could not hear the person on the other end of the call, but I heard enough to understand one thing. Whatever was happening in my marriage had started long before that afternoon. A few minutes later, she ended the call and walked into the kitchen. The smile appeared immediately when she saw me. "You are home early," she said. "Inspection got canceled," I replied. She nodded and kissed my cheek before grabbing her purse. "I am meeting a friend for coffee." Then she left. I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the garage door close. The house felt different after that. Not because anything obvious had changed. The furniture was still where it had always been. The family photos still lined the hallway walls. The grandfather clock still ticked in the living room. But for the first time, I felt like I was standing inside a story without knowing the ending. Most people imagine that betrayal arrives like a lightning strike. The truth is often quieter. It arrives as a question, a feeling, a small crack in something you believed was solid. That evening, I sat on the back patio watching rainwater drip from the oak trees. Rachel returned home around 7. We ate dinner together. She asked about work. I asked about her day. To anyone watching, we looked like a normal couple discussing ordinary things. Yet every answer suddenly sounded different. Every smile carried new weight. Every pause seemed longer than before. I did not confront her. I did not accuse her of anything. I simply watched. Over the next few weeks, I noticed details I would have ignored before. Her phone was never out of reach. She started taking certain calls outside. She spent more time away from home, usually explaining it as work obligations or social events. None of it proved anything. But together the pieces formed a pattern. One Friday evening, she left her tablet charging in the kitchen while she took a shower upstairs. A message notification appeared on the screen. I was not trying to invade her privacy. In fact, I looked away at first. Then another notification appeared. And another. The sender's name was Brandon. My stomach tightened. The messages themselves were not explicit. They did not need to be. Familiarity has its own language. The kind of language people use when they share more than friendship. I set the tablet exactly where I found it and walked out of the room. That night, I barely slept. The ceiling fan rotated slowly above our bed while Rachel slept beside me. I stared into the darkness, thinking about every year we had spent together. Every sacrifice, every milestone, every promise. The easy thing would have been to react immediately, to demand answers, to force a confrontation. Instead, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. If Rachel was hiding something, I needed facts. Not assumptions. Not emotions. Facts. The next morning, before the sun came up, I poured a cup of coffee, sat alone in my office, and began preparing for a truth I was no longer sure I wanted to find. The following Monday, I made a phone call I never imagined I would make. The private investigator came recommended by an attorney I trusted, a man who had handled several complex business disputes for my company over the years. His name was Daniel Mercer. Former law enforcement, quiet reputation, meticulous work. The kind of person who spoke less and noticed more. We met at a small diner 30 miles outside the city where nobody knew either of us. The coffee tasted burnt, and the booths had probably been there since the early 1990s. Daniel listened without interrupting while I explained what little I knew. When I finished, he folded his hands and looked at me for a long moment. "Do you want assumptions?" he asked. "Or do you want facts?" I remember staring out the window at a pickup truck pulling into the parking lot. "Facts," I said. "Only facts." He nodded once. "Then give me time." Time turned out to be the hardest part. People think discovering the truth happens in dramatic moments. Most of the time it happens slowly. One piece at a time. A receipt. A photograph. A timeline. A pattern. While Daniel worked, life continued as normal on the surface. Rachel and I attended a charity dinner together. We smiled for pictures. We sat beside each other at a neighbor's backyard gathering. We discussed grocery lists and utility bills. From the outside, nothing looked different. Yet every ordinary moment felt strange now. Every conversation carried an invisible second meaning. I found myself studying details I never noticed before. How quickly she responded to certain messages. How often she checked her phone. How her mood seemed tied to conversations that had nothing to do with me. 2 weeks later, Daniel called. His voice was calm. I think we should meet. We sat in his office the next morning. There was no dramatic speech. No emotional build-up. He simply opened a folder and began laying photographs across the desk. Rachel entering restaurants. Rachel meeting Brandon Pierce. Rachel leaving office buildings after hours. Rachel spending time with him during periods she had described to me as work commitments or social events with friends. None of the photographs showed anything inappropriate. They did not need to. The frequency told the story. The consistency told the story. Most of all, the secrecy told the story. I looked at the photographs one by one. My hands remained steady. Inside, though, something shifted. Not because I was surprised. Deep down, I think I already knew. The evidence simply removed the last excuse to doubt my own instincts. Then Daniel slid another document across the desk. This concerns me more, he said. It was a timeline. Rachel's meetings with Brandon stretched back much farther than I expected. Months. Maybe longer. Far longer than someone would spend planning a simple friendship. My eyes settled on one date near the top of the page. 3 months before the phone call I overheard in the sunroom. 3 months. That meant whatever was happening had already been underway long before I became suspicious. I leaned back in my chair. The office suddenly felt smaller. There is something else, Daniel said. He opened another folder. Inside were records showing consultations with a family law firm. Initial meetings. Follow-up appointments. Document requests. Strategy discussions. Rachel had not just been considering divorce. She had been preparing for it. Carefully. Methodically. For a long time. The realization hit harder than anything else. Not because the marriage was ending. Because she had already built an entire plan while pretending everything was normal at home. I drove back to Dallas that afternoon with the radio turned off. Traffic crawled along Interstate 30. Trucks moved slowly through the afternoon heat. The city skyline appeared on the horizon like a distant photograph. I kept thinking about one question. Why was she so confident? People only become that confident when they believe they already know the outcome. That evening, Rachel came home carrying takeout containers from a restaurant we both liked. She smiled as she walked through the door. I thought we could have dinner together, she said. I smiled back. Calm. Friendly. Completely in control. What she did not know was that the man sitting across from her at the dinner table was no longer trying to figure out whether something was wrong. I already knew something was wrong. The real question now was how much she was hiding, and I was beginning to suspect the answer was bigger than either of us imagined. Over the next several days, I stopped looking at Rachel as someone I needed answers from and started looking at the situation as a puzzle that was still missing pieces. The evidence Daniel had collected confirmed more than enough to explain why my marriage was falling apart, but it did not explain the confidence. That part continued to bother me. Every time Rachel spoke about the future, every time she casually mentioned finances, every time she discussed plans for the coming year, there was a certainty behind her words that felt rehearsed. It was the confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. People do not act that way unless they think they are protected by something. One afternoon, Daniel called and asked if I could meet him again. His tone was different this time. Not urgent. Careful. I arrived at his office just after lunch. The Texas heat shimmered above the parking lot, and the air smelled like asphalt baking under the sun. Daniel handed me a folder thicker than the previous ones. I think we found the missing piece, he said. Inside were records connected to Rachel's consultations with her attorneys. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. But when combined with everything else, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Rachel had not simply been preparing to leave the marriage. She had been building a narrative, documentation, financial summaries, selective records, notes about my schedule, notes about company assets, notes about future claims. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. This was not an emotional decision made during a difficult season of marriage. It was a long-term strategy. Months of preparation, months of positioning, months of moving pieces into place while pretending life at home was normal. Then Daniel showed me something else. You should pay attention to the dates, he said. I did. The timeline revealed a detail that made my stomach tighten. Many of the meetings occurred before Rachel had any reason to believe I suspected anything. Before the tension, before the distance became obvious, before the arguments that usually accompany a failing marriage. She had started planning while we were still taking weekend trips together, while we were still hosting neighbors for dinner, while she was still telling me everything was fine. I sat quietly for several moments. The office clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, traffic moved through the intersection below. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet nothing felt the same anymore. There is another question you should ask yourself, Daniel said. Who benefits from this plan besides Rachel? That question stayed with me all the way home. That evening I parked in the driveway and remained in the truck for nearly 10 minutes. The sun was setting behind the neighborhood rooftops. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across green lawns. Kids rode bicycles down the street. Everything looked peaceful, normal. Yet Daniel's question echoed in my head. Who benefits besides Rachel? Later that week I got my answer. It happened by accident. Rachel left her laptop open on the kitchen island while she stepped outside to take a call. The screen displayed a shared calendar. Most of the entries meant nothing to me. Lunch meetings, appointments, work obligations. Then one entry caught my attention. A private meeting scheduled during a time she had told me she would be attending a professional networking event. The location matched a restaurant that appeared multiple times in Daniel's reports. Brandon's name was attached to the reservation. I closed the laptop and walked away. Not because I was shocked anymore. The shock had passed weeks ago. What remained was clarity. Piece by piece, the truth was assembling itself. Rachel was not simply leaving me. She was building a future that already included someone else. And she believed she could walk into that future carrying everything she wanted from the life we built together. That realization should have made me angry. Strangely, it did not. Instead, it made me calm. Extremely calm. For the first time since this began, I stopped wondering whether the marriage could be saved. The question no longer mattered. What mattered was understanding the entire board before making my next move. A few days later, as Rachel sat across from me at dinner discussing vacation plans she clearly had no intention of taking with me, I noticed something I had missed before. She was not worried. Not even a little. She believed she was controlling the timeline. She believed every important decision still belonged to her. And that confidence was creating a weakness she could not see. Because while she was focused on preparing her exit, she never stopped to consider that someone might be quietly studying every move she made. By the time she finally decided to file for divorce, she would believe she was springing a surprise. What she did not know was that the surprise belonged to me. From that point forward, I stopped reacting and started preparing. Most people assume preparation looks dramatic. It does not. Real preparation is quiet. It happens in conference rooms, legal offices, and early morning meetings when nobody is paying attention. The week after my conversation with Daniel, I scheduled a meeting with Benjamin Carter, the attorney who had represented my company for nearly a decade. Benjamin was the kind of lawyer who never rushed a conversation. He listened carefully, asked precise questions, and never wasted words. His office overlooked downtown Dallas, and from the 32nd floor the city looked orderly and predictable. My life did not feel either of those things anymore. I spent nearly 3 hours walking him through everything Daniel had uncovered. The timeline, the meetings, the consultations, the documentation Rachel had been collecting. When I finished, Benjamin remained silent for several moments. Then he folded his reading glasses and set them on his desk. "The good news," he said, "is that you came here before she filed." I remember leaning back in my chair. "Why does that matter?" He gave a small smile. "Because preparation favors the person who starts first." That sentence stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Preparation favors the person who starts first. Rachel believed she was the planner. She believed she was the strategist. What she never considered was that her confidence had created a blind spot. She assumed I would remain exactly where. She left me while she organized her next move. She assumed wrong. Over the next several weeks, Benjamin assembled a team that reviewed every major financial structure connected to my business. Accountants examined records. Advisors reviewed ownership documents. Contracts were analyzed. Nothing improper. Nothing hidden. Just a careful examination of assets, liabilities, and legal protections that already existed. The process reminded me of preparing a building before a major storm. You do not wait for the weather to arrive. You reinforce what matters while the sky is still clear. During the day, I continued running the company as normal. Construction schedules moved forward. Client meetings filled my calendar. Employees came to me with questions and decisions that had nothing to do with my personal life. In some ways, the routine helped. Work gave me structure. It gave me something solid to stand on while everything else felt uncertain. At home, Rachel seemed increasingly relaxed. The closer she moved toward her objective, the more comfortable she became. Sometimes I would catch her smiling at messages on her phone. Other times, she would mention future plans in ways that subtly excluded me. Little things. Small details. Easy to miss if you were not paying attention. I noticed all of them. Yet I never confronted her. That was the part she understood least. She expected resistance. She expected questions. She expected emotional reactions. Instead, she received calm. Looking back, I think that unsettled her more than any argument could have. One evening, she asked whether I would be attending a charity gala with her the following month. The question surprised me because by then I knew she had already met with attorneys multiple times. Sure, I said, if you would like me there. She smiled. Of course. We attended together. We shook hands. We posed for photographs. We spoke with donors and business owners. Anyone looking at us would have seen a successful married couple enjoying a formal event. What they would not have seen was the reality hiding underneath. Rachel was already planning her exit. I was already preparing for it. The difference was that only one of us knew both sides of the story. Around that same time, Daniel delivered another update. There were no major revelations. In fact, that was the revelation. The pattern remained consistent. The meetings continued. The communications continued. The planning continued. Nothing changed because Rachel believed there was no reason to change. She thought her future was secure. She thought every important variable was under control. The more comfortable she became, the more information revealed itself naturally. By the time autumn arrived, Benjamin had assembled a comprehensive legal strategy. Every document was organized. Every timeline was verified. Every important detail was supported by evidence. We were not building a reaction. We were building a response. There is a difference. A reaction is emotional. A response is deliberate. One afternoon, as I stood outside a construction site watching steel beams rise against a bright Texas sky, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Rachel. Just 3 words. We need to talk. Most husbands would have felt dread reading that message. Strangely, I felt something else. Certainty. Because after months of preparation, I knew exactly what conversation was finally coming. And for the first time since this entire story began, I realized I was no longer waiting for Rachel's next move. I was waiting for the moment she finally discovered she was not the only person playing the game. That conversation happened 2 days later. Rachel waited until after dinner. The dishes had been cleared. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic moving along the highway a few miles away. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. For a moment, she looked almost nervous. Then the expression disappeared. Confidence returned. Looking back, I realized she had probably rehearsed every word. I think we both know this is not working anymore, she said. I nodded slowly. If that is how you feel. The response caught her off guard. I saw it in her eyes. Just for a second. She had expected resistance. Maybe questions. Maybe an emotional discussion. Instead, she found calm. Again, I have already spoken with an attorney, she continued. I think divorce is the best path forward. Outside, a light rain had started tapping softly against the windows. The sound filled the silence between us. All right, I said. Rachel blinked. That is it, she asked. That is it. She studied my face as though searching for something. Anger, fear, confusion. Any reaction that would confirm the version of events she had built in her head. She found none of them. The truth was simple. By then I had spent months preparing for that exact moment. There was nothing left to surprise me. Over the next several weeks, Rachel became increasingly comfortable. The divorce filing moved forward. Meetings were scheduled. Financial disclosures were requested. Deadlines appeared on calendars. Through it all, she carried herself like someone who already knew the ending of the story. Sometimes I would catch her smiling while reading messages on her phone. Other times, she would leave the house claiming she was meeting friends or handling errands. I never challenged the explanations. I never asked where she had been. The less pressure she felt, the more predictable her behavior became. One afternoon, Benjamin called me into his office. Several thick folders sat neatly arranged across the conference table. Accountants had completed their reviews. Advisors had finalized their reports. Every important document was indexed and organized. Benjamin flipped through the pages with the confidence of a man who preferred preparation over improvisation. Everything is ready, he said. I looked down at the stack of paperwork. Months of work reduced to paper, ink, and facts. Do you think she knows? I asked. Benjamin smiled slightly. If she knew, she would not be acting the way she is acting. That answer stayed with me. Because Rachel was acting exactly like someone who believed she was in control. The confidence never left her. If anything, it grew stronger as the court date approached. A week before the hearing, I attended a charity luncheon downtown. Several business owners from the area were there. Contractors, developers, attorneys, and local executives. Brandon Pierce happened to be among them. The first time I had seen him in person since everything began. He greeted people easily, shook hands, shared stories, laughed at conversations. If he felt any concern about the future, he hid it well. At one point our eyes met across the room. He offered a polite nod. I returned it. Nothing more, nothing less. Yet something about the moment struck me. Neither of them had any idea how much information had already been collected. Neither of them understood how thoroughly Benjamin and his team had prepared. They were moving through life believing they were several moves ahead. The reality was very different. The evening before the court hearing arrived with surprising calm. Dallas glowed beneath a clear sky. The city lights reflected against office towers and glass storefronts. I sat alone on my back patio with a cup of coffee long after sunset. The air felt cool compared to the summer heat that had dominated the previous months. Inside the house, boxes were already packed. Certain rooms felt emptier than they used to. The life Rachel and I built together was ending. That part was undeniable. Yet as I sat there listening to the rustle of leaves in the dark, I felt something unexpected. Not sadness, not anger, clarity. Months earlier, I had been chasing questions. Now I had answers. Months earlier, I had been reacting to discoveries. Now I was prepared for outcomes. My phone buzzed shortly before midnight. A message from Benjamin. Just 4 words. See you tomorrow morning. I looked at the screen for a moment before setting the phone down. Across town, Rachel was probably reviewing plans with her attorneys. She was probably imagining the future she expected to claim. She was probably walking herself through a version of tomorrow where everything unfolded exactly as she intended. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. Because while she was preparing for a victory she believed was inevitable, the most important facts in the entire case were already waiting inside a courtroom she had not entered yet. The courthouse felt colder than I expected that morning. Not because of the temperature, because of the atmosphere. Every hallway carried the weight of decisions that would change people's lives. Lawyers moved with purpose. Clerks pushed carts stacked with files. Conversations stayed low and measured. Nobody came to a courthouse expecting celebration. Yet as I stepped through the security checkpoint and entered the main corridor, I immediately noticed something different about Rachel. She looked confident, more confident than I had seen her in months. She wore a tailored navy suit, carried herself with perfect posture, and walked beside her attorney as though they were heading into a meeting whose outcome had already been determined. When our eyes met across the hallway, she offered a polite smile. Not warm, not hostile, just confident. The kind of smile people wear when they believe they are holding the winning hand. I returned the gesture and continued toward the courtroom with Benjamin beside me. How are you feeling? He asked quietly. I glanced at the heavy wooden doors ahead of us. Better than I expected. Benjamin nodded once. Good. Stay exactly that way. We entered a few minutes before the hearing began. The courtroom was smaller than most people imagine. Television creates the illusion of giant chambers filled with spectators. Reality is different. Rows of wooden benches. A judge's bench raised slightly above the floor. State flags standing motionless in the corners. Fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. Ordinary surroundings for extraordinary moments. Rachel sat with her attorney at the table across from ours. Several folders rested neatly in front of them. Every few minutes they leaned toward each other and exchanged quiet comments. From the look of things, they were relaxed, comfortable, prepared. If anyone had walked into the room without context, they would have assumed they were the side entering from a position of strength. The hearing began promptly. The judge reviewed procedural matters first. Names, documents, timelines, routine legal housekeeping. Then the discussion shifted toward financial disclosures and asset division. That was where Rachel's attorney became noticeably more aggressive. He spoke with confidence. He outlined requests. He referenced valuations. He discussed future distributions and ownership interests. Listening from across the room, I could almost see the narrative taking shape. Successful business owner. Shared marital assets. Expectations regarding division. Everything presented neatly. Everything presented logically. Rachel sat quietly beside him, occasionally nodding. Her expression never changed. Not once. Looking back now, I think that was because she believed the difficult part was already over. She believed filing for divorce had placed her in control of the timeline. She believed preparation alone guaranteed success. Benjamin listened without interruption. He took occasional notes. He reviewed documents. Sometimes he adjusted his glasses and glanced toward me. Otherwise, he remained completely calm. The contrast between the two tables became impossible to ignore. One side was pushing forward with visible confidence. The other side seemed content to wait. Nearly 40 minutes passed that way. Then something interesting happened. The judge asked a simple question regarding financial disclosures and supporting documentation. Rachel's attorney answered immediately, confidently, thoroughly. Yet Benjamin requested permission to clarify several points. His voice remained steady, professional, almost conversational. He referenced dates, timelines, consultations, records. Nothing dramatic, just facts, one after another. At first Rachel looked unconcerned. Then I noticed a subtle change. Her attention sharpened. The smile disappeared. Not entirely, just enough to reveal uncertainty. Benjamin continued. Each question led naturally to another. Each clarification connected to a larger picture. The courtroom remained quiet except for the occasional rustle of paper. No raised voices. No arguments. Just facts moving steadily into the record. I watched Rachel glance toward her attorney. The confidence that had followed her into the building earlier that morning seemed slightly less secure now. Small details began attracting attention. Dates that overlapped. Statements that required explanation. Documentation that raised additional questions. Nothing decisive yet. Not by itself, but enough to alter the atmosphere in the room. Benjamin was not presenting conclusions. He was establishing foundations. Building structure. Piece by piece. Brick by brick. Exactly the same way a construction project begins long before anyone sees the finished building. Across the room, Rachel shifted in her chair for the first time all morning. It was a tiny movement. Most people would have missed it. I did not. Because I knew something she still did not know. Everything happening in that courtroom was only the beginning. The most important documents had not been discussed. The most important evidence had not been introduced. The most important questions had not yet been asked. Rachel entered the courthouse believing the hearing would confirm the future she had already imagined. As the morning moved forward, I began to realize she was slowly discovering a possibility she had never seriously considered. The possibility that someone else had been preparing just as carefully as she had. The shift became impossible to ignore shortly after the lunch recess. The courtroom had the same quiet atmosphere when everyone returned to their seats, but something had changed beneath the surface. Rachel knew it. Her attorney knew it. Even the judge seemed more attentive than before. Benjamin opened a new folder and placed several documents on the table with the same calm precision he had displayed all morning. There was no dramatic gesture, no theatrical reveal, just paper, facts, and preparation. The strongest moves are usually the quietest ones. Benjamin requested permission to introduce additional supporting records connected to the timeline already discussed. The judge agreed. One by one, the documents entered the record. Communication timelines, meeting schedules, financial records, consultation dates. Individually, none of them looked extraordinary. Together, they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Rachel sat perfectly still at first. Her eyes followed each page as it appeared on the display monitors. Her attorney objected occasionally, but the objections achieved very little because every document had already been verified and properly submitted. Benjamin was not making accusations. He was establishing chronology. That was the genius of it. Facts require far less defense than opinions. The timeline showed that consultations regarding divorce planning had begun long before Rachel claimed the marriage had become unsalvageable. Additional records demonstrated preparation occurring during periods when she was still presenting the relationship as stable. Then came the financial analysis. Months earlier, Benjamin had instructed forensic accountants to review every relevant disclosure. Their findings were thorough. Certain assumptions presented by Rachel's legal team regarding future distributions and asset valuations no longer appeared as straightforward as originally suggested. Several figures required clarification. Several claims required additional explanation. As questions accumulated, Rachel's confidence continued to fade. I noticed her whispering more frequently to her attorney. Pages were flipped back and forth. Notes appeared in hurried handwriting. The relaxed posture she carried into the courthouse that morning had completely disappeared. Across the aisle, Benjamin remained calm. He never raised his voice. He never rushed. He simply continued laying foundation after foundation. Then came the moment that changed everything. Benjamin introduced evidence establishing the extent of the long-term planning that had taken place before the divorce filing. Not speculation, not assumptions. Documentation. Verified dates. Verified meetings. Verified records. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Even routine courtroom sounds seemed to disappear. Rachel stared at the monitor for several seconds without moving. For the first time since the hearing began, genuine uncertainty appeared on her face. Looking back, I think that was the exact moment she realized something was wrong. Not with the marriage. Not with the case. With her understanding of the situation itself. She had entered the process believing she controlled the information. She believed she knew what I knew. She believed she understood the board. Now she was discovering that entire sections of the board had been invisible to her from the beginning. The judge asked several follow-up questions. Benjamin answered each one directly. Supporting documents were already available. References were already organized. Dates were already verified. Preparation turned every answer into another brick in a structure that had been built long before anyone entered the courtroom. Rachel's attorney attempted to redirect the discussion toward broader financial issues, but momentum had shifted. The conversation kept returning to timelines, planning, disclosures, and documented facts. Every path seemed to lead back to the same uncomfortable reality. Months before the divorce filing, I had already begun preparing for possibilities Rachel assumed I could not see. That realization changed the atmosphere completely. I could almost feel it moving through the room. Not dramatic. Not explosive, just undeniable. Truth often works that way. It does not arrive with noise. It arrives with weight. By mid-afternoon, Rachel was no longer sitting with the confidence of someone expecting an easy victory. She looked like someone trying to understand how the ground beneath her had changed shape. Benjamin closed the final folder and organized his papers. The most important evidence had been presented. The foundation was complete. As the judge reviewed the record and prepared for the next phase of proceedings, I looked across the courtroom at the woman who had once known me better than anyone. Rachel had spent months believing she was carefully leading events toward this exact day. What she finally understood was something entirely different. She had been planning for months. I had been preparing for longer. And for the first time since the hearing began, she seemed to realize that the outcome she imagined was no longer guaranteed. The final phase of the case unfolded over the following weeks, but the outcome had already begun taking shape inside that courtroom. Additional reviews were completed. Final submissions were filed. Questions that once seemed complicated became remarkably simple once every document sat side by side. Facts have a way of doing that. They remove confusion. They strip away assumptions. They force reality to stand on its own. When the court issued its final decisions, the result was not dramatic. There was no celebration, no triumphant speech. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there was clarity. The financial structures that Benjamin and his team had reviewed months earlier held exactly as intended. Ownership interests remained protected according to their legal design. Valuations were determined by verified records rather than expectations. Claims were measured against evidence instead of assumptions. The future Rachel imagined collecting looked very different once every fact was placed under scrutiny. I remember sitting quietly as the final matters were resolved. Rachel looked tired. Not angry. Not defeated. Just tired. For the first time since this entire process began, she no longer looked like someone carrying certainty. She looked like someone confronting consequences she never expected to face. Her attorney spoke with her several times after the hearing concluded. Papers changed hands. Additional discussions followed. The confidence that had once defined every step she took through the courthouse had disappeared completely. Across the room, Benjamin gathered his files with the same calm professionalism he had displayed from the beginning. No victory speech. No unnecessary commentary. Just preparation doing what preparation was designed to do. As we walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, the Texas sky stretched bright and cloudless above the city. Traffic moved steadily through downtown Dallas. People hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Life continued exactly as it always had. It struck me how strange that felt. For months my world had revolved around questions, investigations, documents, meetings, and court dates. Yet outside those courthouse walls, the world never paused for any of it. A few days later I returned fully to work. Construction projects that had been moving forward throughout the entire ordeal continued taking shape across North Texas. Steel frames rose into the skyline. Concrete foundations became office buildings. Crews arrived before sunrise and left after long, productive days. There was something comforting about it. Buildings do not care about betrayal. Deadlines do not care about divorce. Work demands your attention, and sometimes that is exactly what a person needs. Over time, I heard occasional updates about Rachel. Mutual acquaintances mentioned changes in her life. New plans, different priorities, different circumstances. I never asked for details. The truth was that I no longer needed them. For too long, my attention had been focused on understanding what she was doing. Eventually, I realized the better question was what I intended to do next. One evening several months later, I stood outside a newly completed medical facility my company had built on the edge of the city. The sun was setting behind the structure, turning the glass windows gold. Workers were packing equipment into trucks. The project manager handed me a final report and thanked me for stopping by. I stood there for a moment after everyone else had left. The parking lot was quiet. The building reflected the last light of the day. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at peace. Not because everything had worked out perfectly. It had not. 17 years of marriage had still ended. Trust had still been broken. Certain chapters of my life would never return. But peace does not come from getting everything you want. It comes from accepting the truth and moving forward anyway. Looking back, the biggest lesson had nothing to do with courtrooms or legal strategies. It had nothing to do with financial records or investigations. The real lesson was simpler. Confidence without awareness is dangerous. Rachel believed she understood the entire situation because she understood part of it. She believed preparation belonged exclusively to her. She believed she was directing events while everyone else reacted. What she never realized was that the moment I stopped reacting and started preparing, the future stopped belonging to her assumptions. It belonged to reality. And reality, unlike confidence, does not care what anyone believes. It only cares what is true.